Good evening and welcome to this session. We are going to talk about various aspects of democracy and how to sort of defend the established lines of democracy. And today's discussion should be seen against the backdrop of the big elections coming up in 2024. India has a general election scheduled that year. US has a presidential election scheduled. We have elections in the UK coming up, and we have elections in the European Union. So basically, democracies or the major democracies of the world are going to elections next year. Uh, we will work our way through the many aspects of the democratic process, the electoral process, and more importantly, the role of technology, which is increasingly coming to play a dominant role in both the political process of democracies and the electoral process of democracies. So let me begin with Sumit Seth. Sumit, how would you like to sort of frame the points which we are going to talk about this evening?
Thank you so much, Kanchanda, and a very good evening to all of you. Let me begin by, since I'm the co-host of Raisina Dialogue on behalf of the Ministry of External Affairs and the Policy Planning Division of the Ministry, and on my own behalf, welcome you and thank you for your active participation and the kind of conversation you are having in the foyers off stage are very useful. People keep asking me in the corridor, what does Policy Planning Division does? So I thought I'll just give a few seconds. One of our job is to connect the dots. Connecting the dot is the motto of what we work. But before connecting the dots, one needs to collect the dots. The platforms like Raisina Dialogue, Global Technology Summit, Asia Economic Conference, Indian Ocean Conference, all these which are supported by the Ministry of External Affairs, provides us with these dots. Dots are like metaphor for ideas. What you speak in various forums, etc., are very useful for us to provide inputs to policy making and so on, which help us write policy memos, policy papers, which are sometimes said by 4 or 5 people, but those are the people which matter for us in our ecosystem. So I was just thinking of framing this debate on democracy, how you defend democracy in the digital world. So before doing that, let me tell you a story. I take you back in 18th century. There was a person called Jeremy Bentham. I don't know how many of you have read about him. He was given a task of designing a prison in such a way that with minimum deployment of human resource, you could keep an eye on all the prisoners in all the cells. So he came up with an idea which is famously become called panopticon. Panopticon phenomena is where a person is in a big tower somewhere. One person is enough to see because all the prisons are open. One can see throughout. But the very idea that somebody is watching them was enough to keep all the prisoners, disciplined and so on, right? So that idea of 18th century, if you extrapolate in today's digital world, somewhere we all are prisoner of that cell, but this cell is a cell phone through which somebody could, the very idea that somebody is keeping a watch on us itself in this digital world is a little scary, but also should make us even more responsible. How do we deal with the digital world? And it is directly or indirectly linked with the choices people make, whether it is choices to buy products. In fact, all social media companies, digital platforms have this model where they work through content creation, right? Content creation. Then the second thing is advertisement revenue. They drive growth in terms of number of subscribers every day. And ultimately, it all depends on like, shares, heart, which is called engagement. So it is content, advertisement, growth of subscribers, and engagements. It is only coincidental that if you join the first letters, that becomes CAGE, C-A-G-E, right? And it is actually a scary thought that these platforms, which actually were created with a bona fide, allegedly bona fide business model, are being used now today by inimical forces, adversarial forces, to get into the mind space of the subscribers. Their data is being manipulated. Artificial intelligence, machine learning is being used to get into the mind space and also change the behavior. And in this case, the electoral behavior of the voters. And this is where I think this debate is. I think I'll stop here for a while. Maybe I'll come back when, when all my co-panelists. I think as a government functionary, just disclaimer, whatever I'm saying need not be construed as the Government of India policy. For Government of India policy, or you can log on to www.mea.gov.in. That's the official website of Ministry.
Earlier, only governments and its agencies, the regulators, election regulators, conducted or played the role of organizing, facilitating, and then finally conducting the elections. But now you have a third player. The big tech platforms have come in. And how do we then ensure that the guardrails are strong and democracy does not get subverted by instruments that were supposed to be facilitators, but there are genuine questions about them today?
Look, I think for me, if I look over time, for me, I've stood for 5 elections. So that started in 2006 and went all the way up to 2019. So when I first stood for election, there was no third player because there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter. It didn't exist. But by the time 2019, my last election came around, it was something that every candidate used and wanted to use because, in a sense, it was cheap. Facebook advertising is cheap. And so for candidates that want to target who they want to reach and have those political ads get out there to as many as possible, it's very effective. But it does mean that it comes with a huge amount of risk. And I think that's what you go to when you think about what is the responsibility of those third parties, and therefore what is the responsibility of government in terms of its regulation on those third parties. If I look right now in Australia, we are about this year, we are about to have a referendum. We haven't had a referendum in Australia since 1999. So again, a time before the digital age. So this is the first referendum Australia has had in the digital age. This referendum is so crucial for our country because it is about giving our Indigenous Australians, our First Nations people, a voice enshrined in our constitution that will create a body to advise our parliament. Now, for that referendum to be successful, obviously Meta is going to be very much a part of this referendum campaign. We need to ensure, or government needs to ensure in Australia, that it works really closely with Meta to stop disinformation. Now, I understand at the moment the way that's going to occur. Obviously, government itself has created all sorts of mechanisms and platforms already for that. It's created a disinformation register, which is important, as well as campaigns to, educate citizens about looking out for disinformation. But more than that, it needs to work really closely with those digital platforms. And I understand in Australia at the moment, some of that goes to Facebook and Twitter and the like, requiring political advertising or advertising through this referendum to have an authorization. And on top of that authorization, Facebook and so on will have to do fact checking of their ads. So that is the sort of regulatory setup that has been made in Australia with the Australian government and with Facebook to deal with something that we are dealing with in the year 2023. Whether that's going to be enough, time will tell. But, you know, that's something for us to debate here tonight into how much further we need to address this, because we know there has been disinformation in the past in relation to the digital age and elections. So, yeah.
Shivnath, that's a very big responsibility. Supplanting governments. Metaverse will now be the arbiter of democracy.
Before I get to the metaverse, let's talk about the world today. I think metaverse is a little futuristic, but thank you, Kanchanda, for giving us the opportunity. But whenever we sit in a room where those who worry about problems are also the biggest embracing agents of our platform, I think we are talking about solutions. We are not talking just about challenges. So Sumit is one of the biggest proponents of the social media, so thank you for using the platform. Lisa herself said that Meta is going to play a critical role, so clearly you see the benefits of it. I think when you see the benefits and you are able to identify the problems, I think we see that as a very good outcome of the state of problems in the world. 2 or 3 things, if I can share with this group, is one, everything that has been said, I completely agree. It is our responsibility to look at the challenges, come up with ideas, and come up with solutions which then address the problems of today and also address the problems of the future. And the reason I say that is because we have learned from over 200 elections across the world that yes, there is a problem. There is no denying the truth. There is a problem. But what are we doing about it? And which is where the responsibility matrix comes in, Kanchanda. If you look at the platform, I can very proudly say that we are at the cutting edge of taking that responsibility. If you look at the measures that we take, whether it's curbing down, there are 2, 3 vectors on how these things happen, right? One is what Sumit alluded to, but I will frame it, is called coordinated inauthentic behavior, which is what we call CIB. We have cracked down on over 200 such networks in 68 countries across 42 languages, which indulge in such behavior. There are other vectors, such as fake accounts. We take action on fake accounts on a regular basis, on a daily basis. Just to give you a statistic, if you're interested, just to give you the scale of the problem, and I will come to that in a second. In the 4th quarter of last year, we cracked down on 1.3 billion fake accounts on Facebook and about 9.6 million accounts on WhatsApp. These are all fake accounts. You are not telling us to do it. We are doing it on our own. So clearly we bear the responsibility. It is our problem, but we didn't create the problem. The problems comes from the real world. It is happening in the offline world. If somebody tells me that bad actors are only existing because of online platforms, I would strongly disagree, because bad actors have been here before Facebook arrived. Bad actors have been trying to influence democracies across the world before any social media platform arrived. So to blame the platform, I don't think it's the right framing. But it is absolutely right to tell us what is the responsibility that you're taking. Beyond that, there is another vector within the responsibility framing which I want to share, is at this company, what we are trying to do from a safety lens, twofold solution. One is the kind of investment. Everybody says, are you investing enough? You may always say it's not enough, but I think we are trying. It is never a perfect solution. With over 40,000 people investing over $16 billion over the last few years, investing resources to just cut across languages, across many countries, just to defend that the right to express your opinion so that you are not influenced by what such coordinated inauthentic behaviors do, is what we are doing. The other part, which I think Lisa alluded to, issues around misinformation, issues around working with regulators. In India, we took a lead in 2019 to partner with the Election Commission of India, where we launched the Voluntary Code of Ethics, where we take kind of their legal valid orders and take action on content which they say is misleading.
We will come back to
No,
disinformation.
I'm just giving you the framing that you talked about responsibility. These are certain evidentiary points on responsibility that platforms need to take, and we have taken, and completely agree that we have to work together on this.
Thank you.
Can I just ask one question then? Why?
We'll
why?
come back.
But why is Meta then requiring doing a test in Australia for putting in place a subscription fee to require, if you want that protection of impersonation, for example? Why make the user of Facebook have to pay
We can
for
come
that
back
protection?
to this question
I'm
when
happy
we
to
talk
take this
about
offline.
disinformation.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Manuel, what is the European view on this?
Well, it's wonderful to be here. So thank you for the invitation. And I'm not sure if I know the full European view, but I'll give you my own interpretation of this. And I worked in the Spanish Foreign Ministry for some time before coming back to academia. And the Spanish Foreign Ministry belongs to a network of centers. We had a unit at the ministry that is connected with units across the EU that fight disinformation. It's coordinated by the External Action Service, which is a bit like the Foreign Ministry of the EU. The first thing is that we now track disinformation campaigns. We track their volume, we track their content, so we know roughly what they're about. And some very interesting readings have come out of this, and there's a strategy for response across governments, and we share best practices. And what's interesting is that these campaigns, they don't forward a particular view of the world. So it's not as if these, the people trying to interfere in the electoral process in the US or in the Brexit referendum in the UK or, in the French presidential elections have a particular preference for or against Macron or for or against Brexit. At the end, what connects all of these campaigns is their desire to undermine our trust in our institutions. They're there to undermine our belief in our ability collectively to attain objective truths. So they're truly anti-enlightened, right? They're revolutionary and they're anti-enlightened because they want us to question the truth. And they do this by attacking our intermediation institutions, the legitimacy of our press, of our parliaments, of our political parties. So this is really a tumor at the heart of deliberative democracies because we do not know how to sustain effective and legitimate deliberative democracies if we cannot sustain a healthy public debate. But I have an opinion on what has also been discussed now because I think we live in a moment where there's like a dual tragedy that's occurring. One is we've had the emergence of a set of actors in our information space that are irresponsible actors, and this is not a normative, this is not an assessment, I mean, it's not my opinion. They are objectively non-liable for the content they distribute. And in fact, they fight, they make the case very strongly not to be liable because the argument is social media platforms, they are notice boards where people put out information, but they're not there to regulate, mediate what is being distributed through the platform. That basically constitutes and has built a social media space where there is very little responsibility for the distribution and dissemination of untruthful facts and of campaigns of disinformation. And I think we're relearning as we speak today what we had to learn through the libel laws and others, which is if you are in the business of structuring the public debate, you have to have high responsibility over what you distribute. And my expectation, and I think this is what's going to happen if you're in the business of the sharing of pictures of cats, then that's fine, right? But if you're in the business of distributing information and then that's a different ballgame altogether. So I think what you're going to see in the coming months and years is we are going to rebuild an entire liability architecture and the ontological architecture on social media platforms, equivalent to the one that we had for traditional media. Of course, the argument is we're going to go bust, we cannot do this. Well, that's the responsibility that comes with doing these things. And the second tragedy is that these platforms get funded through a very similar mechanism to the one used by traditional media. So their rise has produced the growing erosion of the economic health of newspapers, of TV channels, of radio channels, and many others that precisely adhered to these norms of veracity, fact-checking, and liability if what they put out was untrue. So I think that what we're going to see is just this emergence of an entire architecture of liability and responsibility. In the US in particular, by the way, I mean, this is a particular act of Congress, and it can be changed. And it's an act that excludes these platforms from the traditional liability of other media companies. Of course, they claim they're not media companies. So it's a regulatory affair. And I know many of them are doing immense efforts, like Meta and others, in trying to comply with these things. But it's not about their effort. It's about what us as a society deem necessary in terms of standards and adherence to truth, and how we put that into the regulation and into the framework of what they have to do. And I'm sure if we do that, then they'll get on with it and they'll do a very good job at it.
Thank you. Rachel, this whole thing about liability and how do we create a liability architecture? In the US, there's a very intense debate which is going on right now. That's an issue in India also. I mean, when does an intermediary cease to be an intermediary and becomes an interventionist player? And it's being debated very hotly. So can you just tell us something more? I mean, are you planning to change the law? Will platforms now be held accountable, or should it at all be that way?
So first, I think it's important to note that the United States is still reeling in many ways from the fallout of the 2020 election and the mis and disinformation that was championed by many members of the US political class and then perpetuated by members of the mainstream media to millions and millions of people across the United States. And it's hard to overstate the fallout of that mis and disinformation. You have the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, which many people in the United States still believe. You had the issue with Dominion voting machines that I'll get to in a few minutes, where people basically said that this Dominion voting machine company was able to switch votes in their machine. That wasn't true. You had violence against local election officials in many cities across the United States. And then ultimately, you had the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, which just shows you how far bad actors and bad information can go. This has led to extreme polarization in the United States. And the word disinformation is a third rail at this point. The Biden administration tried, for example, earlier last year to create a disinformation governance board within the Department of Homeland Security that was basically just meant to better coordinate efforts within the department to fight mis and disinformation from foreign actors in the United States. And the right went absolutely crazy, called it a ministry of truth that I think comes from Harry Potter. It really went crazy, and the person that was supposed to lead that disinformation governance board, who's like my age, has been getting death threats for literally every day for a year. So it's just something that's hard to tackle in the United States. Luckily, we didn't see the sort of issues in the 2022 election that we saw in 2020, but we are heading into 2024, and there are a few things that I'm going to be looking at really closely. The first is the relationship that tech companies build with people on the ground working on elections, and that should happen early. That should happen now, given that you already have presidential races that are underway and Senate races that are underway. So those relationships where it provides time for feedback on effective tech products to basically help safeguard elections. It helps build relationships with people doing the work, including with local media in various voting precincts in the US. And it provides an opportunity for early scenarios planning to account for potential day of and after post-election day scenarios that could come to pass. And so I think those relationships between various tech companies and locals are really important. The second thing that I'm going to be paying attention to is what comes out of the $1.5 billion lawsuit that Dominion Voting is bringing against Fox News for perpetuating the disinformation that they helped steal the election in 2020. These cases are famously hard to win because these companies are protected by the First Amendment, which is free speech in the United States, and you have to be able to prove malicious intent. Now, Dominion Voting Machines company was able to get a hold of text messages that were sent between Fox News people that showed that they knew that they were perpetuating mis and disinformation. So if they win this $1.5 billion lawsuit, I think it's really going to set the stage for how tech companies talk about 2024. So we'll be watching that closely. The final thing is Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act of 1996, which basically protects tech companies from the information that third parties put on their platforms, which basically means that you can say whatever you want on Twitter, on Facebook, and you're not going to get in trouble. The company is not going to get in trouble because they are protected by Section 230. The Supreme Court last week listened to a couple cases that refer to Section 230, but they've made it pretty clear that this is an issue for the US Congress to take care of. And so it's going to be really interesting to see if anything comes of that. I'm not hopeful that this is going to change anytime soon because there's no clear sense of how Section 230 needs to change, only that it has to be refitted for today's technology environment, which is vastly different than it was in 1996. So those are just a few things that I'm going to be watching pretty closely.
Thank you. Shivnath, I will just come back to you because let's talk disinformation. Okay, it's hard to prove malicious disinformation or malicious content, but the fact is that we are increasingly witnessing a certain proclivity to unleash not only disinformation but malicious disinformation, weaponized disinformation. And we have also seen tech companies, big tech, allowing their platforms to be hijacked by those behind these organized disinformation campaigns. Lisa asked you about why is Facebook now changing its own terms of engagement, and do we really need to look at it at a transnational level, that tech companies have to change their rules? And linked to that, of course, we saw, and it's only now that evidence is coming out, how Twitter, for instance, played a interventionist role by suppressing facts, suppressing stories, which may or may not have impacted the outcome of the US election. But the fact that it happened is worrisome. And it's possibly happening all the time and we don't get to know about it.
Kanchanda, that's a great question, but I'm the wrong person to ask that because I don't work for Twitter. I can tell you what Meta does. Is disinformation, misinformation a big problem? Yes, it is. I will not deny that. It's a question of how do we frame what we are doing about it as platforms. I can tell you that as intermediaries, for us to say, I will decide your truth and your false is also not fair. You do not want us to do that. The day I do that, you will say, hey, you're intervening, so let me take away your intermediary status. By the way, in India, Lisa, just so that you know, I think Manuel talked about regulations. I think Indian government has been extremely forward-looking and progressive when it comes to intermediary regulation. The kind of approach they've adopted around due diligence conditions on intermediaries is a good evidence of the fact that yes, regulations can definitely help to create a framework. It's not punitive, it is definitely obligatory. And it is linked to our intermediary status. Coming back to disinformation, Kanchanda, I think I cannot solve for the real world problem of those who create disinformation. There are people out in the world who are doing it. I cannot go and control them. What I can do is what I'm doing on my platform. Three-pronged principle: remove, reduce, and inform. We depend on third-party fact checkers who are certified, and India seems to be wanting to create its own fact-checking network. We depend on them, and when they declare something as true or false, we would label a content like that. We remove the content if they violate our community standards. We reduce their circulation if it is labeled by a fact checker, and we inform the user that you may be sharing something which has been fact checked as false. So at the end of the day, if you look at it, is what is the technological solution? You're expecting a technological solution from us. You're not expecting to decide what is true or false. and which is where our responsibility comes in. I think Manuel also talked about something around what do we do as a society, and not just look at it from the prism of, hey, Mr. Company, what are you supposed to do? And I think that's the most critical thing, which is, by the way, playing out in India. I'm happy to answer your verification question in a second, but again, that's where India has shown the way. The government of India has actually made it obligatory on us to help verify users. We've already made the first move on that. And it has obligation on the platforms to allow that option for the users to verify themselves if they want to. It is not mandatory, but we have made provisions for the user to say, hey, this is me, this is my phone number. So it's a question of how regulation plays at the crossroad of how they want to work with tech companies. By the way, a lot of the G20 countries today ask us, how is India managing to do this? And I think it's a great example how regulations of companies and countries can work together on this.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. The new IT rules, especially the amended version, are sort of a trendsetter in terms of dealing with intermediaries and creating a governance architecture. Sumit, how does government deal with disinformation, weaponized disinformation, especially when it sort of becomes, it goes beyond government in terms of aiming to create turbulence, upsetting the political process? Surely government has a role in that also.
Definitely. Well, I was just thinking how to put this, I can give you a list of steps to be taken, but I thought I'll treat this question slightly differently by giving you an analogy of something which we all faced in last 2 years. How did we deal with COVID, a virus? There are various strategies. One strategy is lockdown. Shall we lock down digital medium? It's not possible. Temporary solution could be there. But the second thing, which is important, is using masks. Masks here is a metaphor for filtration of content. This is what companies like Meta and other digital have to do it. But that also is not the only solution. We need to vaccinate. We need to create factual correctness of, you cannot stop the flow of information. That's the difference between autocracies and democracies. There is an unequal, asymmetrical game. Autocracies can turn off, shut down all the windows, raise their walls, firewalls, and so on. It's okay, but in a democratic society like India, openness is the sine qua non. So when you open up, the possibility of vulnerabilities attacking us, especially from inimical forces, are also there. So we need to build that immunity, that vaccination, etc. Right? But the fourth thing, I think, which is going to actually solve this in long run, is the digital hygiene, the social distancing kind of a thing. People should be educated about that. Whatever you are putting on social media, you are responsible for that. You have to understand how do you follow those digital hygiene practices, and also not to believe what you see on social media. This is a long-term education process. It has to begin from schools. Like there is a talk about, sex education, there is a social media education or digital education is to be imparted. There has to be a subject in schools at some formally, informally, where people are taught about, because kids are the most vulnerable people in this. Because today, anybody can create accounts, though, you have this temporary age bar, but kids are smarter than most of your coders. They are able to, circumvent this, right? So this is how it is going to happen. Now, what is the end game? How does it work? There is a classical X curve which can explain how we were able to overcome COVID. The human immunity kept increasing. The virulence of the virus has progressively decreased, and they have crossed over, and there is a X. If you make a graph, it will become the virulence of the virus has gone down, human immunity has gone up, and after we cross this intersection, that is where we are all safe. Today we are not wearing masks here, we are shaking hands, we follow social distance. Same thing applies for digital medium, which is that This disinformation graph has to come down. People's awareness, people immunity, people education, and understanding of social media has to go up. And once we cross this intersection, that is where, I take this cue from the emblem of India, Satyamev Jayate. That is where the truth will prevail. That is where the truth will triumph. This is how we are going to deal with it. Thank you.
Sumit, incidentally, is
Disclaimer,
medical doctor.
Medical doctor once upon a time.
He thinks up these.
Pardon, I apologize for, but that naturally comes to me.
No, I mean, it's a great idea to have a democracy vaccine for the digital space. But I doubt if it is going to work. I mean, what do you do with something like WhatsApp, where conversation is encrypted? And it's awash with amazing disinformation. Some of it is very benign. I mean, meet this elephant with six legs or something like that. But some of it can be very, very malicious. And a lot of it can qualify as direct intervention in the political process. Lisa, what has been the Australian experience? You were mentioning that the Australian government has been working on it, and the political parties have involved themselves in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to pick up a little bit on what everyone's really contributed so far, in the sense that we're here on this panel talking about defending democracy in the digital age. I think from what I've heard so far is that we need now more than ever strong and robust democracies, because what is clear to me is that digital platforms are not going to act on disinformation if the regulations aren't strong enough, if the regulations aren't there. And so it is a huge responsibility for our democratic structures, for our governments, to really lead the way, because I really don't think digital business is going to. And I think that's what we're seeing. And that's why we're seeing different outcomes in different countries, because some democracies are stronger than others, or some, haven't had the difficulties in the debates that others have had. And so I feel for Rochelle talking about, what's going on in the United States, which obviously, has been heralded for many a decade as, a light on the hill in terms of its democracy. That the erosion of that public trust, which feeds into the democratic system, because it voters then lose trust in electoral officials, in public servants, in the officials that are carrying out those elections. And I think that is a real issue. I mean, I recently returned from Fiji. I was part of the official observer group for the Fiji elections. Fiji, for the first time, decided to use digital technology for that election. They used an app, not for voting, but for uploading of the voting result. There was a glitch. The app went down at 11 p.m. with a certain amount of votes tallied at that point and uploaded, and then it came back up live again at 2 a.m. with a completely different set of numbers. So, of course, outcry amongst the opposition parties, particularly, because of what the difference of voting and what it was showing, that the incumbent was winning when they weren't at 11 p.m. But what it was doing is actually undermining the trust in those hard-working electoral officials that were doing the right thing, and who knows why the glitch happened. There was a recount and it all got sorted. But I mean, those sorts of things happen all the time because of technology. And, and this is where it does come back to needing the best. And I'm proud that Australia, the Australian Electoral Commission, has one of the best sort of, democratic regulatory platforms that obviously that exist in our democratic world. That's really, really important. Now, obviously, we're a small voter base in Australia compared to larger countries like India.
You make a very interesting point on how technology can be used for manipulating elections. We recently had the Nigerian election, and everybody knows how that was manipulated. Manuel, do you have any views on this? How to deal with this attempt to manipulate election outcomes?
So a quick reflection on the prior debate on on regulation of social media or not, just a one-liner, because evidently, if we do bring in a regulatory framework, some voices are going to be left out. So there is a restriction of the content shared through these platforms. The question is, do we want veracity and fact-checking and truthfulness to be at the core of what is distributed in these platforms or not? And I have a colleague that is very interested in the history of Cádiz, a city in Spain in the 1800s. You know, people have the most particular set of interests, and he's been very focused on this. And in Cádiz, there was a moment where we had thousands of newspapers. So anybody that could afford a print would own one of these pamphlets, and they were used to libel. They were basically used to libel until regulation came in, and this was banned, and we regulated the space. Do we have less voices in Cádiz and less newspapers? Sure we do, sure we do. We don't have 1,000 newspapers in a tiny city in the south of Spain. But the things that are now published and distributed are truthful, particularly in traditional media. On the elections, and I wanted to introduce something in the discussion because I think, I'm an IR, I'm an international relations person, and we're in the middle of this debate of sort of the systemic collision between democracies and autocracies. The European Union has now labeled formally China as a systemic rival, and there's a reason for that labeling. And emerging technologies are being used in part of the world, first to surveil and to repress minorities and dissent in a very sophisticated way. So I don't know, if you remember the beginning of the protests in Hong Kong a couple of years ago, the protesters were taking down camera towers, so they knew very well what they were fighting, a very sophisticated surveillance state. But there's more to this, and I want to take a second on this. If you think for a second of political systems as systems of information. So think of democracy as a nervous system. The freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom of association, the right to vote. These are mechanisms by which, in democracies, the preferences of people are injected into the decision-making bodies. And one of the most pro-democratic, strongest pro-democracy arguments is that democracies listen. Democracies are capable of knowing what the periphery of the polity wants, right? Now, some colleagues in China and in other places are saying, but hold on, you guys, you are in the 1.0 system. That's an outdated way of assessing. We don't need to listen to what our citizens need. We are going to infer preferences from surveilled behavior. So we're going to take their behavior and we're going to infer what they want. And some folks have been speaking of a technological leviathan, sort of the system. And there's a fascinating question here, which is, do emerging technologies, particularly surveillance and AI technologies, do they change the balance of sustainability across democratic and autocratic states? Do they make autocratic states more sustainable? And I think we have a real output legitimacy challenge. Are autocracies, because of these technologies, are they going to be able to produce output legitimacy, as they seem to be able to do, in a way that they didn't in the past? So this tech debate, final phrase, this tech debate, it goes well beyond the regulation of social media platforms and the regulation of our democratic processes. It's about a systemic collision and the principles that underpin the deployment of these technologies in our societies. It might sound like a slightly academic argument, but I can guarantee you this is of concerns in capitals, in chancelleries around the world, this issue.
Thank you. Rachel, a quick last question before we go to the audience for their questions. Are we going to see algo increasingly driving electoral choices? Like Google shall prompt you whom to vote for and not vote for. I mean, do you sense that coming?
Well, this is a really interesting point, because Lisa, what you said is right. I don't think tech companies are going to regulate themselves. They don't want to wade into this. So it really is, at least, especially in the United States, a question for Congress. I do wonder where we are going to land on the issue of algorithms. You get on YouTube, you can be watching cat videos, and within an hour, you're watching videos on how the Democrats are running a child trafficking ring out of a pizza joint in Washington, D.C. This is true. Like, this is a serious thing that is an issue in the United States. And so I wonder if that is where some of the middle ground is, where companies are going to be more liable for the algorithms through which they push their users to view certain types of content. The last thing I'll say is that, you know, people should want to participate in democracy. Participating in democracy, expanding access to voting should be a good thing. And in order to do that, people have to trust the political system. They have to trust their governance system. And we're really running into a problem with that in the United States. Many things make a democracy work, but I think one of the most important things that makes a democracy work is the willingness of people to be governed by a person or party for whom they did not vote. And we are not there in the United States right now, and I think it's a long way before we get back to that. And so that's something that I think all of us will be thinking very hard about and working towards in the coming years.
Kanchandra,
Thank you.
Since you promised a lively debate, I just want to correct one fact, just if you allow me. I know Lisa has been a politician, but you talked about tech companies will not regulate, governments have to. In your country, New Zealand, European Union, they're all asking industry to self-regulate. So just wanted to put that on record for the...
No, but that doesn't seem to be
No,
working.
I'm just saying that this is the governments are asking the companies to self-regulate, despite, and we welcome progressive regulation, by the way.
Okay. So we can take a couple of questions from the audience. I know all of you, I'm very hungry. So, yeah.
It sounds to me, something I've been thinking about in this panel, I think brings this point home. There's a vicious cycle and a conflict of interest almost about who's accountable. And it goes from the private companies and the private public companies that have, you know, they maximize shareholder value and this is what they want to do. And you can say that you want to, you know, filter content until we're all blue in the face, but at the end of the day, you have shareholders and a stock price and what gives. And the same thing, I think, for regulators. I think a lot of them, in a lot of the democracies, America for sure, it was too little too late. And now it's like, you know, he's scrambling. And this creates this vicious cycle. So
who
where
would
does
like
the accountability at the end?
Yeah, so where is the accountability at the end? Where does the buck stop?
You're asking
Thank
me?
you.
You're asking me?
I'm asking the panel.
Anybody,
No
who wants to answer it?
shareholder
Lisa?
value. I'm happy to answer this. No shareholder, no company wants to operate in an environment without being accountable. We are absolutely accountable to the laws of the land.
I'm not blaming you. I'm saying that
I'm answering you. I'm not taking the blame. I'm just answering that if you're asking who's accountable, if I have to operate in India, I have to respect local laws.
the thesis will go, though, that because you weren't being held accountable, not in India, but on a global scale, that you were able to kind of maximize shareholder value while, you know, America and what Rachel said, you know.
Well, that has been the standard perception, but I think that perception needs to change if we have to guardrail democracy from bad actors using big tech and big tech just worrying about their bottom line. Any other question?
I run a media company, and I'm responsible for anything libelous which I broadcast or print or digitally distribute. If somebody says something libelous and I publish it, I am liable. So I am still puzzled, in fact flabbergasted, that this debate is still going on whether the tech companies are a platform or are a publisher. In my view, they should be publishers because they are distributing the content. Most of the time, they're not even creating the content, right? Besides the fact that they're taking the breakfast, lunch, and dinner of all the legacy companies, right, with all the advertising they take. So why is this question not settled? Are they a publisher or are they a platform?
Yeah, Manuel?
Just real quick, because I think this is the core. I think this is the core of the debate. And I think there are complexities and there are particularities about how social media platforms function when it comes to regulation. But at the end are they just platforms or are they media companies? My opinion is that they're media companies and they should be treated as such. But where does the buck stop and who's responsible? And to be frank, and we were just discussing this bilaterally, I think it lies with regulators because they're already doing a ton of things and we're asking them to do things that they shouldn't be doing. We are the ones that need to set the regulatory framework for them to operate within. And I see our congresses and our regulators really falling behind on this. And it's not, it's complicated to an extent, and it's extremely radically simple to another, which is we cannot have this completely unlevel playing field when it comes to responsibility and liability of content.
We talk about defending democracies, and you guys concentrate a lot on elections, but what about democratic values? So in Thailand, there are laws that are considered undemocratic, like the less majesty law that punish people for criticizing the monarchy. In this case, do big tech follow local regulation, or is there a third-party judgment somewhere? In Myanmar, worse, Facebook algorithm from time to time have been, in many investigations, including Reuters, shown that have contributed to the Rohingya genocide and later, propaganda of the Myanmar military. So who would, mediate in this kind of situation?
But it needs to be also mentioned, Reuters is an interested party as far as Myanmar is concerned, because 2 of the journalists, I think, were arrested. So let's see, keep that in mind. Who would like to take on that question? Lisa, would you like to come in?
When you've got, in the case of Myanmar, a failed state, right? So therefore, you don't have a robust and strong democratic structure. In the case of Thailand, that's a new one. I think, yes, democratic values do need to be questioned if we're going to talk about, rights and responsibilities and accountability. I think this is where, though, if we look at all of the democracies across the board, governments in themselves just haven't kept pace with the speed of technology. And therein lies the issues here. We're all playing catch up. I don't think there's any democracy that's, ahead of the game here. Even in Australia, we've got so many different acts at the moment that we're trying to simplify into one sort of, easier sort of regulatory framework. It's just a mess. And, we've really got to play catch up if we're going to get on top of this.
Okay, the last question again to the young fellows, if you have one.
Just on the question of Meta, I think we can't just keep talking about Facebook. A lot of disinformation is spread on WhatsApp, and I think there have to be new age solutions to combat that, which do not violate privacy and also...
Ma'am, that's a comment, not a question.
I'm asking.
What is the question?
The question that I'm asking is, what are the new age solutions?
Okay.
I think essentially this problem is called wicked problem. How do you balance between openness, flow of information, at the same time checking it? I think the answer lies in finding something. I think we are looking at the food. So there is a famous story, a tale in childhood called Goldilocks. So Goldilocks principle is required, neither too hot, not too cold. Somewhere we have to find out a middle ground where there is a free flow of information. At the same time, we are sanitized from disinformation, fake news, and so on. So that's where probably...
I just want to add to that. I welcome this question, and I think it's a very pertinent question, and I'm glad that you talked about that user privacy is also important. So you agree that, I hope you agree that respecting privacy of users in an end-to-end encrypted environment is important. However, what we do is, at least at a WhatsApp end, we believe that the control lies with the user. If you see something which either you don't like or you believe is false, you have the right to block it, report the user, block the content. The power is with the user at the end of the day. That's one part where the user controls exist. The other part is what we do with partnership through, as Sumit has been saying, what is the digital literacy approach that we take? And we do it at scale, whether it's partnership with civil society organizations, agencies like National Commission for Women, or along with think tanks to make sure that we are able to teach what is called digital hygiene. So you can decipher for yourself. In an end-to-end encrypted environment, it's very difficult for us because we can't see any message, we don't store any message. But yet, we have a structured program where certain aspects of the platform are needed to be taught to the user at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, it's the user who will decide what is right or wrong for them. And what we do as a product, which is the most critical part, if you see, a few years ago, virality was a big problem. There were issues about mob lynching, and it was India which kind of led to the solution where WhatsApp decided to curb the forwarding of messages to 5 and highly forwarded messages to 1. It led to a 70% drop in virality on WhatsApp platform. We didn't care. We had to do it because it had to check virality. So I think it's a combination of product solution, programmatic intervention, and giving users more right to decide what they want to do.
I have a slightly different view on that. That is, this amounts to tech platforms passing the buck to the users. I mean, it sounds very nice that users have the right and the choice and the responsibility. No. Anyway, I think we had a great conversation, and I think we are all hungry.
Yeah. One last line. I don't know how many of you have watched Social Dilemma, but there's one line which reverberates in my mind, and maybe I want to leave that thought with you. If you're not paying for the product, then you are the product.